Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Michael was getting ready for another show with his new band, Midnight Highway. It was one of those nights that felt completely ordinary, nothing special, just another gig at the Rusty Lantern, a bar where musicians went hoping to get noticed. While tuning his guitar backstage, his mind was somewhere else: bills to pay, unfinished songs, scattered memories of a life he was still trying to piece together. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary until she walked into the bar. Jenna arrived with a friend, the kind of person whose presence changes the room even without saying a word. Michael first noticed her between songs, when his focus shifted from the stage to the crowd. But the moment their eyes met, something inside him stirred. She was different from any woman he'd ever paid attention to. During the break, she went up to the bar, and without knowing why, he decided to walk over. They started talking easily, naturally. It felt like they'd known each other for years. She talked about old books and orchestra concerts, and he told her about chords and garage recordings. Their worlds seemed different, but somehow they fit. The following week, she invited him to something completely outside his usual routine, a symphony concert. Michael hesitated, but said yes. Sitting beside her, surrounded by violins and flutes, he realized there was beauty in things he'd never allowed himself to feel before. The way Jenna listened, eyes closed and a small smile on her lips, made him want to know her beyond bar conversations. After the concert, they walked together and opened up more than they'd planned. Michael talked about his lonely childhood and his distant relationship with his father, and Jenna shared how her mother taught her to notice the details others overlooked. That night became the first chapter of something that promised to grow. The weeks that followed were full of discoveries. Michael, who usually got involved with intense but short-lived relationships, was surprised by Jenna's consistency. They argued sometimes, sure, because he was impulsive and she was more cautious, but they always laughed about it afterward. Conflicts turned into lessons. Once, he showed up late to her birthday and found the table empty. He thought she'd left, but she came back with 2 milkshakes and said it was okay, as long as he never lied. Another time, he almost cancelled a planned weekend when an important producer called with a last-minute opportunity. Jenna didn't get angry, she just said she'd wait for him to decide what he wanted to build, a career, or a life with someone. And he chose to be with her. Months passed, and their relationship naturally deepened into something more serious. Michael felt secure. It wasn't blind passion, but a solid connection. They were syncing their routines, learning each other's flaws, and figuring out how to live with silence. When he decided to propose, it wasn't at an expensive restaurant or during a fancy trip. It was on her couch, after watching an old movie. He simply pulled the ring from his pocket and told her he knew what he wanted for the rest of his life. She laughed, then cried, and said yes. He hugged her, and for a few seconds, everything felt perfectly in place. Jenna became part of the band's rehearsals, part of his family, part of his daily life. She helped him organize contracts, gave feedback on songs, brought tea when he lost his voice, and left encouraging notes in his instrument case. Friends noticed how different he seemed, less explosive, more grounded. He looked happy. And he was. For the first time in years, Michael believed he'd found someone he could share not just the present with, but all the tomorrows that hadn't happened yet. But as with anything that starts too perfectly, there was a shadow he chose to ignore. A name that occasionally came up in casual conversation. A past Jenna claimed she'd left behind. Derek Johnson. Michael pretended it didn't bother him, that it wasn't a threat, that trust mattered more than jealousy. And maybe it did. Still, there was something about that half-told story he never fully understood. Even so, he kept moving forward. Because he was in love. And because he believed that sometimes, love was enough. Michael never liked goodbyes, especially when uncertainty was involved. Watching Jenna pack for her permanent move to Charlotte left a bitter taste in his mouth that even her words couldn't wash away. It was a great professional opportunity, she explained, a once-in-a-lifetime chance to lead a new project that would solidify her career. He knew that. He also knew that, as hard as it would be, he needed to support her. But distance would test everything they'd built so far. The first few days were filled with messages, video calls, promises of frequent visits. Michael tried to fill the emptiness by throwing himself into band work and keeping his mind busy. Jenna, meanwhile, seemed excited about the new challenges, but also tired, torn between a demanding schedule and the growing weight of missing him, something that slowly became a burden for both of them. Still, they kept trying. It was during one of those calls that she mentioned, almost carelessly, that Derek had been transferred to a nearby city. She said it was a coincidence, that she only found out after accepting the new job. Michael froze inside but pretended not to care. He wanted to avoid unnecessary arguments, so he just listened. He tried to trust, mentally repeating that the past was in the past, that their present was strong. But that piece of information kept nagging at him like a pebble in his shoe. As the weeks passed, something changed. Messages became less frequent. Her replies grew shorter, farther apart, almost robotic. When they video called, Jenna seemed distracted, distant. There was always a new excuse, endless meetings, company events, unexpected visitors. Michael tried to understand, to excuse each absence with reasons he didn't even believe himself. Still, he kept defending the woman he'd chosen to share his life with. Until one day, he stopped recognizing himself. One night, he called earlier than usual, unannounced. Jenna answered sounding annoyed. She said she was busy and would call back later. There were voices in the background, muffled laughter, and she hung up before he could ask anything. Michael stayed awake all night, his mind racing with unanswered questions. The next day, she called like nothing had happened, but he was already different. He started noticing details, seeing the effort she made to seem casual. Sometimes, she spoke like she was reading lines. Her words lost weight. Her tone lost soul. Michael decided to surprise her one weekend. He bought a ticket, packed his bags, and sent a message from the airport saying he needed to see her. Jenna tried to hide her shock, saying she was in the middle of a complicated event and might not have time. Still, he went. When he arrived, the apartment door was locked, the lights off. He waited in the car for hours until she finally showed up, accompanied. They were laughing together. When they saw him, Jenna froze. Derek stepped back, but Michael already knew. She approached, pale, and asked to talk in private. Inside the apartment, she started speaking with tears in her eyes. She tried to explain that things had gotten out of control, that she never planned any of it. She said Derek had reached out just to talk, and that the strain of distance and work pressure led her to make a mistake. That she was confused. That she felt alone. She insisted she still loved Michael, that this wasn't who she wanted to be. He listened in silence. He didn't interrupt or react. When she finished, she begged for forgiveness, hands trembling, face desperate. He looked at her steadily, like someone watching a person who no longer exists. Then he picked up the keys from the table, placed them on the couch, and walked out. The divorce happened weeks later. Jenna still tried to fix things. She wrote letters, sent messages, showed up at band rehearsals. Michael ignored every attempt. The betrayal wasn't just physical, it was about breaking something much deeper. He felt used, humiliated, deceived by someone who swore she'd stand by him even on the hardest days. The pain settled deep, quiet, like a crack in a wall no one sees from afar but that weakens the whole structure. It changed him inside. It left a space he wasn't sure could ever be filled. And even surrounded by friends and band commitments, he felt too alone. Something inside him had died. And he didn't know how to bury it. The time after the divorce was a desert for Michael. Days lost their names, hours blurred together. He started waking up without purpose, sleeping without rest, eating out of obligation. His guitar, leaning in the corner of the room, felt like a foreign object, as if it no longer belonged to his identity. Music, once his refuge, now felt like a burden. Friends tried to talk, made plans, called him, but Michael avoided it all. Life was happening outside while he stayed trapped in a space where silence never ended. For weeks, Parker was one of the few who kept pushing. He sent funny messages, showed up with beer, played old movies. Parker understood silence and respected emptiness. They'd known each other since high school, shared stages and stories. Parker was the one who introduced Michael to his first serious producer, defended him in fights with shady managers, helped hide the engagement ring before the surprise for Jenna. So when Parker died in an accident, the already cracked ground beneath Michael finally gave way. The news came in a text. A mutual friend wrote, "Parker's gone. Car. Late at night." Michael didn't reply. He just stared at his phone as the world around him faded. Then he got up and locked himself in his room. He stayed there for days, listening to old voice messages, rereading conversations. Parker's laughter now sounded like echoes from a life he wasn't sure he wanted anymore. In that silent grief, depression took root. He'd wake up but not get out of bed. He'd spend hours staring at the ceiling. Sometimes he thought about going out, but gave up before even putting on his shoes. The band had already fallen apart. The other members went their separate ways after Michael stopped showing up. No one blamed him, but everyone knew it was over. He stopped eating properly, lost weight, began forgetting the lyrics to his own songs. He felt empty, like a background character in his own story. One day, his sister showed up unannounced. She found the apartment silent, messy, and Michael on the couch with an empty bottle beside him. She cried, argued, tried to shake him somehow. He barely responded. After that, she started coming regularly, bringing food, clean clothes, repeating phrases he didn't even register. The following weeks were slow and painful. But his sister's constant presence began to crack his apathy. Michael caught himself listening to a music snippet, then opening his guitar case. He couldn't play long, but it was something. During one visit, she brought an old friend from the local music scene, a guy named Devin who was starting a new project. He said he needed a creative guitarist, wanted something more organic, raw. Michael refused immediately. Said he was out, that it wasn't the right time. Devin thanked him and left. A week later, he came back. Then again after that. The third time, he left a USB drive with 3 unfinished demos on the table. Michael ignored it for 2 days but eventually listened out of curiosity. The sound stirred something long asleep. The third riff sounded exactly like a progression he'd started months before, and it made him pick up his guitar with focus for the first time. He spent the afternoon writing, and the next day, he called Devin. He accepted the offer. That's how the new chapter began. The John Reginald Group wasn't just a band, it was a space for rebuilding. Rehearsals started in small studios with makeshift gear. With every finished song, Michael reclaimed a piece of himself. The other members also carried stories of loss, and that shared pain created a quiet bond between them. No one pushed too hard. Every small step was celebrated. The stage, which for months had been a place of pain, became a place of expression again. During a show on the alternative circuit, Michael saw the audience truly react to a song he wrote in honor of Parker. There were no lyrics, just instrumentals. But the emotion was so clear that the crowd fell silent at the first chord. At the end, they stood and applauded. Michael didn't say a word. He just looked up at the sky, closed his eyes, and took a deep breath. He hadn't overcome the pain. But he'd found a place for it inside himself. After that, his routine started to balance again. He began going out, reconnecting with people, reaching out. His sister mentioned a party she was hosting to bring together old friends and suggested he come. Michael thought about saying no, but ended up saying he'd think about it. For the first time in a long time, he considered the possibility of being in a room full of people, conversation, laughter. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but something inside told him it might be worth trying. Michael arrived at the party with no expectations. He'd accepted the invitation more to please his sister than out of real desire. He didn't dress up much, just something simple, and carried that constant alertness that still lived in his body, even on calm days. He'd relearned how to smile in public, to seem okay, to hide the hole still inside him. He was whole enough to keep going, but still too guarded to truly open up. Right at the entrance, he was greeted with enthusiasm. Old friends seemed genuinely happy to see him, and he responded with polite gestures and a few hugs. A couple asked about music, the new band, his routine. Michael gave basic answers. At one point, when he stepped away from the noise, his sister approached with a different kind of smile. Before she even introduced her, he knew this wasn't random. Claire Morgan stood beside her, holding a glass, her gaze calm, the kind that doesn't need to try to be kind. The introduction was quick but effective. Claire spoke little, listened a lot, and Michael, without realizing it, felt at ease. It was different. No forced charm, no rehearsed lines. She didn't seem impressed by the idea of a musician in front of her, and maybe that was the first sign this was out of the ordinary. They talked for a few minutes, and when the music got louder, they moved to a quieter corner of the house. They talked about everything, except past relationships. Claire mentioned her work reading books for the visually impaired, something she volunteered for on Saturday mornings. Michael was surprised by how simple the gesture was. She also said she sometimes spent Sundays helping her grandmother at a community center. Everything she said came naturally, without heroics, without putting herself in the spotlight. Just a good person doing what felt right. And it affected him. At the end of the night, they exchanged contacts. No promises. No games. Michael left with a quiet sense of lightness, like an inner door had cracked open. In the days that followed, he thought about her often. He sent a message 2 days later, suggesting coffee. Claire replied calmly, setting the meeting for the next Saturday. When they met again, the conversation picked up right where it left off, as if no time had passed. Claire was practical but sensitive. Direct, but kind. Michael realized he didn't have to pretend around her. In one conversation, she mentioned she'd read a book about grief and invisible healing. He listened quietly. When she finished, he opened up. He told her about Parker. He shared what he'd been through after his friend's death. Claire didn't say she understood, didn't offer rehearsed comfort. She just listened. And that was more healing than any therapy. Their meetings became regular, movies, walks, live music, long talks about random topics. Claire got to know him slowly, without rush or pressure. Michael was surprised by how she respected his silences, how she never demanded immediate answers. Sometimes he talked about Jenna, and Claire listened without discomfort. She'd just say that some pains take longer to leave the body, and that was okay. None of her words carried competition or comparison. It was like she understood that someone's past doesn't need to be erased for the present to matter. For the first time in years, Michael began sleeping better. Melodies returned to his mind with clarity, lyrics flowed without effort. The band noticed the change. Their shows became more intense, more honest. Fans started to notice. One night, after a powerful performance, Claire was waiting outside. He hugged her with a force that came from deep inside. It wasn't planned. It was pure. Months later, on an ordinary weekend, they sat in silence. Claire held a mug and commented on a movie they'd watched. Michael interrupted and, with a calm that surprised even him, said he loved her. Claire didn't answer with words. She just looked at him for a few seconds and kissed him. In that moment, he realized, it wasn't about forgetting what he'd lived, but about being able to live again, truthfully. The first night they spent together, there was no rush, no pressure. It happened naturally, expected, yet surprising in how it unfolded. Afterward, Michael felt his body and heart finally realign. What they had wasn't an escape or a shelter. It was a choice. A decision. Slowly, they began sharing more of their daily lives, short trips, home-cooked dinners, quiet afternoons just sharing space. It wasn't a fairy tale. They argued, had scheduling conflicts, disagreed on things. But everything was resolved through conversation, listening, maturity. Michael learned that loving calmly could still be powerful. And that sometimes, the right story begins just when you've accepted there might not be another one to write. The reunion with Jenna wasn't planned. Michael had been in Denver for just over a year, now living with Claire, sharing a home, plans, lazy Sundays, and peaceful silences. The band was doing well. The John Reginald Group had gained recognition in the indie scene, and his songs were praised for their raw honesty. One regular afternoon, leaving the studio after a recording session, he got a short message from his sister, "She's back." No name. No context. But he knew exactly who she meant. That same night, Jenna called. Her voice sounded different, softer, hesitant. She said she needed to see him. That it was important. He stayed quiet. Didn't answer right away. For years, he'd rehearsed this moment, imagined what he'd say, how he'd react. But when it finally came, all he felt was a strange, almost clinical distance. Like it was happening to someone else, a younger, more naive version of himself. 2 days later, he agreed to meet her at a cafe. Jenna arrived early. She looked worn down. Her gaze, once confident and captivating, now carried exhaustion. She said life hadn't turned out as she hoped. That Derek had used her and then disappeared. That her job fell apart. That she'd had a health issue, and only then did she start to understand the damage she'd caused. Michael listened carefully, but without emotion. She cried. Apologized for everything. Said she just wanted forgiveness, that she regretted throwing away what they'd built. He took a deep breath before speaking. He said forgiveness wasn't the issue. That he'd already forgiven her, because he needed to move on. But that didn't mean going back. He told her he knew everything, about Derek's manipulation, the lies, the deliberate betrayal, and that even knowing that, he chose not to carry bitterness. Jenna reached for his hand, but he gently pulled away. He said he was doing well, that he'd rebuilt his life, that he'd found someone who truly loved him, someone who chose to be with him every day, not just the easy ones. Jenna lowered her eyes. She tried to insist, said she still loved him, wanted one more chance, that she could start over. Michael answered firmly. He said their time ended the moment she chose someone else instead of fighting for them. That love can't survive without respect. And that he'd finally understood that. That same night, he came home to find Claire reading on the couch. He sat beside her and told her everything. Didn't hide a thing. Claire listened quietly, and when he finished, she simply said she trusted him. That she was glad he'd finally closed that chapter. Michael was more moved than he expected. Because right there, in that room, he realized how grateful he was to have someone who didn't doubt him. Who didn't demand dramatic explanations. Who just understood. Later that week, he took her to the spot of their first picnic. He prepared everything, the same fruits, the same cheap wine, even the same faded blanket. He waited for her to finish eating, then pulled a small box from his pocket. Claire looked up, surprised. He didn't give a speech. Just opened the box and said, "I want everything with you." She smiled, said yes, and hugged him like someone who knows exactly what they're choosing. The wedding was simple, surrounded by friends, music, and a few honest tears. Instead of a party, they had a special band show. Claire stayed backstage, but danced through every song. After that, life settled the way they dreamed. They bought a small house, adopted a dog, traveled to new places, argued over silly things, made up with hot chocolate, learned to live with each other's quirks. It wasn't a perfect story. It was real. Jenna disappeared from their lives for good. Michael never looked for her again. Not out of spite, but by choice. He decided to live the present with the intensity he'd always wanted, and now that present had a name, a scent, morning laughter, and support on hard days. When their son was born months later, Michael cried in the hospital holding the baby. He looked at Claire and knew everything he'd been through had led him exactly to this moment. The pain, the loss, the betrayal, the grief, everything had been the bridge to the love he deserved to live. And in that instant, with the child sleeping on his chest, he understood that forgiveness was essential, but starting over was a decision. And he'd made it with his whole heart. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.
Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Gregory had always been the kind of man who found beauty in quiet routines. At 45, he lived in San Antonio, Texas, with his wife Maureen, a woman around the same age, originally from Boston, with whom he'd shared many years of marriage. Their relationship was seen by close friends as stable, mature, and free of conflict. They didn't have children together, and that never seemed to weigh on the relationship. Both found in their life together a safe comfort zone, marked by simple gestures, mutual respect, and a rare kind of peace. Weekends were filled with light walks, coffee at local bakeries, and occasional visits to antique shops, a passion they'd shared since their honeymoon. But Gregory's past held deep scars he carried quietly. His first marriage happened when he was still young, to a woman named Caroline. They met early in life, and she already had a young son, Elliot, just 2 years old, from a previous relationship. Gregory didn't hesitate. From the beginning, he treated the boy as his own, calling him son as naturally as if biology had never mattered. Caroline died young, taken by an aggressive illness, leaving behind not just a huge void but also the responsibility of raising a grieving boy still growing up. Gregory took on that responsibility with courage. He raised Elliot with everything he could offer: love, discipline, guidance. Old photo albums held pictures of the two during moments that ranged from trips and park afternoons to nights of pizza and old movies. For years, it was just father and son facing the world together. Time passed, and Gregory eventually met Maureen through a mutual friend. Their relationship grew naturally, and it wasn't long before she became part of the household routine. Though she wasn't especially affectionate toward Elliot, she always behaved respectfully, treating the boy politely while keeping a certain distance that Gregory interpreted as caution. At 17, Elliot was selected for a cultural exchange program that took him overseas. It was a joint decision, supported by his father, who believed international experiences were important for personal growth. The boy grew up fast. His years abroad shaped him into an independent person. After finishing his studies, he decided to stay abroad for a while, working on short-term projects, learning new languages, and broadening his worldview. 5 years passed in total, with occasional emails to his father and sporadic Sunday night calls. At 22, Elliot decided to come back. He said he missed home, Texas food, the dry climate, even the porch where he used to study on spring afternoons. Gregory welcomed him with open arms, happy to have his son back under the same roof. Maureen also accepted his return, somewhat reserved but without creating obstacles. The dynamic among the three seemed calm. Each had their own routine. Gregory stayed steady in his job in civil projects, Maureen kept her circle of private students, and Elliot looked for job opportunities while readjusting to life in the United States. The house had its silences, but none of them seemed tense. On the contrary, there was a quiet harmony, supported by the maturity of age and the trust built over time. To Gregory, everything seemed in order. He had a stable wife, a present son, a well-kept home, and a pace of life that, though simple, fulfilled him. Nothing suggested anything was wrong. Mornings began with the smell of bacon and eggs, dinners happened over light conversation, and Sundays were reserved for small outings or trips to the neighborhood bookstore. The stability was so constant it started to feel permanent. And precisely because of that, he never imagined what was about to happen. That morning started like so many others. The San Antonio sky was clear, heat already building before 7, and Gregory was getting ready to leave the house with the calm of someone following a well-rehearsed script. He'd slept in the bedroom with Maureen, as always, exchanged a few soft words with her upon waking, and eaten the meal she'd prepared. The smell of waffles lingered in the kitchen when he walked out the door with his briefcase, already thinking about his first appointment of the day. As usual, Maureen stayed behind, tidying dishes and sorting papers scattered across the counter. Gregory got into his car and headed toward the main avenue. Traffic was still light, and he used the brief window to mentally review his day's schedule. But when he stopped at the first red light and reached for his phone to check messages, he noticed his pants pocket felt lighter than usual. He automatically patted it and realized his wallet wasn't there. He frowned, checked the passenger seat, his bag, quickly looked in the center console, nothing. The wallet had been left at home. With a resigned sigh, he turned at the next available spot and drove back along the same streets, unaware that this small detour would completely change his life. As he approached the house, Gregory noticed the front door only slightly ajar, which wasn't unusual when he left in a hurry. He parked in his usual spot, turned off the car, and climbed the porch steps. He pushed the door open casually, already thinking about where he might have left the wallet. He walked in calmly, passed through the hallway toward the bedroom, but as he went by the living room, what he saw froze him completely. The scene in front of him stopped time. On the living room couch, Maureen was sitting with Elliot between her legs. They were kissing. It wasn't a long hug or an ambiguous gesture. It was a full, deep kiss, with no hesitation. Elliot's hands firmly held her waist, and both had their eyes closed, completely unaware of the world around them. Gregory froze for 2 seconds that felt like a century. His heart slammed as if he'd been punched in the chest. The sound that came from his throat was more of a growl than a word, a choked scream that shattered the air and snapped them both back to reality. Maureen jerked back, eyes wide. Elliot pulled away too, instantly pale. Gregory moved forward, unsure whether to yell, hit, or collapse. Thoughts collided in his mind, and instinct took over. He lunged toward his son, wanting to understand, wanting to force answers out with his hands. Elliot, quicker and terrified, jumped back, bumped into the coffee table, and ran toward the door. Gregory tried to reach him, but his body didn't respond fast enough. He chased into the yard, already shouting his son's name, demanding explanations through words heavy with rage. Elliot, sprinting now, grabbed the bike leaning against the side of the garage and disappeared down the street without looking back. Gregory stood on the sidewalk for a few seconds, breathing hard. His muscles trembled, sweat ran down his back, but his whole body felt numb. The world seemed silent. No cars passed. No one on the street. Just him, the morning sun burning his face, and an indescribable pain spreading from the inside out. When he finally got his legs moving again, Gregory went back inside. The house felt different. The same living room, the same furniture, but now every corner carried an invisible stain. Maureen was standing by the couch, hands on her head, eyes red. Gregory walked in without a word. He stopped a few feet from her, staring in silence. There was no more doubt. No room for confusion. No ambiguous interpretation. What remained was raw truth. The woman he'd shared his life with was involved with the boy he'd raised as his son. And that open wound, at that very moment, seemed beyond repair. Gregory stood still, trying to breathe through the chaos as reality collapsed around him. The silence between them lasted only a few seconds, but it felt endless. Gregory stayed frozen, staring at Maureen as if waiting for her to say something, anything that made sense. Maureen, still trembling, gripped her hands tightly, trying to contain the despair spreading across her face. The air in the room felt heavy, as if every breath took effort. She took a hesitant step toward him, but stopped when she saw Gregory instinctively step back. His look wasn't anger anymore, it was ruin. Maureen spoke first. Her voice cracked, low, almost a whisper. She said she didn't know how it started. Said it wasn't planned. That it happened unexpectedly. She talked about loneliness, emptiness, confusing feelings. She tried to explain that Elliot had always been around, that he was attentive, that he listened. That they'd started talking more since his return. That they'd grown closer without realizing it. Gregory couldn't believe what he was hearing. He looked at her as if she were a stranger, as if the words coming from her mouth were part of some delusion. Slowly, his voice grew louder. He asked how she could have the nerve. How she could get involved with someone he raised as a son. How she could hide something so twisted behind a marriage he believed was honest. Maureen cried, tried to touch his hand, but Gregory pulled away, shaking his head, lost between disgust, rage, and disbelief. He asked if she'd even thought of him, if she'd considered the pain this would cause. Maureen tried to respond, but her words couldn't hold up. Each excuse sounded more absurd than the last. She said she felt invisible, that she thought Gregory no longer saw her the way he used to, that with Elliot she felt heard, desired. But she couldn't finish a single sentence without being cut off by her husband's look of disgust. Gregory shook his head, muttering incoherently, trying to piece together what he'd just discovered. He said he didn't want to hear any more. That there was no fixing this. That this wasn't a mistake, it was destruction. It was the death of something that had taken years to build. He stepped away and leaned on the kitchen counter, breathing deeply. He said their marriage ended right there. That she needed to accept that. That there would be no second chance, no room for regret. That he wouldn't be able to look at her again without remembering what he'd seen. Maureen broke down, dropped to her knees in the middle of the living room, begging for calm, for time, for one last conversation. But Gregory was firm. He said he'd sleep in the guest room that night and that from then on, she should prepare for the consequences. He went upstairs without looking back. Each step felt like it weighed tons. When he closed the guest room door, he sat on the edge of the bed and stayed there, staring at the floor. From the other side of the house, Maureen's sobs filled the silence. Gregory couldn't cry. He only felt a huge emptiness, a fatigue that seemed to come from his soul. The woman he'd loved for over 20 years, with whom he'd shared days, joys, and silences, had crossed an unforgivable line. And in that moment, he knew nothing would ever be the same. The next morning arrived wrapped in silence. The light slipping through the window slats didn't bring warmth. Gregory woke in the guest room with a stiff body and an exhausted mind, as if he hadn't slept at all. He sat on the edge of the bed for long minutes, elbows on his knees, hands over his face. Every cell in his body seemed to carry the weight of the previous day. Still, something was different in that moment. It wasn't anger anymore. It was a cold determination that left no room for hesitation. He stood up, took a cold shower, and put on the first clean clothes he found. He didn't exchange a single word with Maureen, who was still locked in her room, quietly crying since early morning. Gregory left the house with his phone in hand, eyes fixed on the screen. He'd written down a few lawyer contacts he'd heard about from coworkers. He called one while on his way. He was answered immediately. 2 hours later, he was in the office of a family law attorney. In a neutral voice, he explained the reason for the separation. The lawyer listened quietly, noted the essential details, and explained the process would take time, that there wouldn't be an immediate divorce, but they could start with a petition for legal separation and temporary measures. Gregory signed the first documents, knowing this was only the beginning of a long road. The lawyer warned, the minimum waiting period in Texas is 60 days. But we can speed up the division of assets once there's an agreement. On his way out, Gregory stopped at a restaurant but didn't even touch his silverware. He opened his laptop, connected to the Wi-Fi, and began searching for apartments to rent. He didn't want to stay in that house another month. Every wall seemed to breathe the truth that had been revealed. He messaged real estate agents, saved a few listings, and scheduled viewings for the coming days. He knew moving wouldn't fix everything, but it was a step. The first step. He felt like someone who had just woken from a coma and needed to act before the pain pulled him back under. In the days that followed, Gregory kept his distance. He left early, came home late, avoided any contact. Maureen tried to talk. She waited for him in the living room, left notes on the table, rehearsed conversations that never happened. She cried softly in the hallway when she saw him, but he didn't respond. He walked straight past, as if she were just a faded presence. On the afternoon of the 5th day, when Gregory returned from an apartment visit, he found Elliot sitting on the front garden bench. The young man had a backpack beside him and his eyes down. He looked like he'd been through rough days, but Gregory wasn't moved. He walked through the gate, stopped in front of him, and waited for him to speak. Elliot tried, in a low voice, to start an explanation. He said he hadn't meant to hurt him, that things got out of control, that there was never any intention to cause pain. Gregory just listened, motionless. Each word seemed to come from far away, as if he were hearing it underwater. When Elliot finished, the father took a deep breath and spoke clearly for the first time. He said there was no hatred, but there was disappointment. That he couldn't look at him the same way anymore. That he had broken something that couldn't be fixed. That even though Elliot wasn't his blood, he was his son by choice, by love, by upbringing. And that this betrayal ran deeper than any other. Gregory was firm, direct. He told Elliot he had 1 week to leave the house. It didn't matter where he went, but they needed to go their separate ways. Elliot tried to argue, but the conversation was over. Gregory went inside, locked the door, went upstairs, and isolated himself again. His son's voice still echoed in his ears, but there was no room for doubt anymore. The decision was made. And he knew that, even without shouts or violent actions, this goodbye was final. The 1-week deadline passed without protest. On the 6th day, Elliot packed his few bags into the trunk of a family friend's car and left in silence. Gregory watched from the upstairs window, showing no reaction. There was no farewell, no exchanged glances. It was as if the bond built over years had been completely erased. Elliot was taken in by his late mother's sister, Gregory's deceased wife's sibling, who lived in a nearby town. That's who he stayed in touch with from then on. In the weeks that followed, Gregory received 2 messages on his phone. The first, sent 3 days after Elliot left, was short: "Dad, I'm so sorry. I never meant to destroy you. If you can ever listen, I'd like to explain." The second came on Gregory's birthday, just "Happy Birthday," no signature. Gregory read them, but didn't reply. He deleted the messages and blocked the number. The silence between them, once just distant, became official. There were no more attempts. The bond, once broken, was never rebuilt. Maureen, meanwhile, tried to stay a few more weeks. She still lived in the same house while the divorce process moved through legal channels, but it was like sharing space with a stranger. Gregory avoided any conversation beyond what was necessary. Her presence caused physical discomfort. Every time they passed through the same room, he looked away, kept his lips tight, his body stiff. Maureen, realizing there was no going back, started packing her own bags. She had no family in San Antonio, and the few people she knew were co-workers with whom she wasn't close. Her only viable option was to return to Boston, her hometown. There, she could start over from scratch, even if under the weight of guilt she now carried alone. She left on a cloudy morning, leaving behind the house keys and a note on the table. Gregory never read it. With the house empty, the divorce process underway, and asset division handled by lawyers, Gregory finalized the rental of a modest apartment downtown. It was small, with 2 bedrooms, a narrow living room, and a balcony facing a busy street. But for him, it was enough. The important thing was being far from everything that reminded him of what he'd lost. He took only essential furniture, a few clothes, and personal items that didn't carry heavy memories. The walls were still bare, but already represented a fresh start. In his new routine, Gregory found shelter in discipline. He joined a running group that met 3 times a week at a nearby park. He started going to the gym during lunch breaks, using work intervals to focus on his body and escape his thoughts. He reorganized his project schedule, took on more responsibilities, increased work travel, and filled every part of his day with activities that kept the emptiness from settling in completely. Gradually, the pain stopped being screams and turned into dull, constant noises, still there, but bearable. On weekends, he started visiting a small downtown cafe where he could sit with a book and watch the street. He wasn't looking for company or distractions, just silence. A different kind of silence than before. This one was his, chosen, intentional. He knew he'd lost 2 people at once. The wife he'd shared 2 decades with, and the son he'd raised from age 2 with dedication and love. This wasn't just a simple loss. It was the demolition of an entire life story. As the months passed, Gregory didn't forget. But he learned not to bend under the weight of memory. He carried scars, yes, but not as burdens. They were signs he had survived. He rediscovered himself in small actions, making his own breakfast, choosing furniture for the new apartment, washing his clothes, taking care of his body, keeping his mind busy. Simple things, but they belonged only to him. Things that carried no one else's shadow. One ordinary afternoon, returning from a run, he stopped in front of the living room mirror and looked at himself calmly. He was thinner, his face more lined, but his eyes were steady. For the first time in a long while, he saw someone who wasn't broken. Not completely. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a few seconds, and then smiled, a quiet, almost imperceptible smile. It was the beginning of something. Something that belonged only to him. Something finally at peace. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.
Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Michael and Claire had been together for over 10 years. To anyone on the outside, their marriage seemed stable, mature, and free of major surprises. They lived in a rented house in a quiet Seattle neighborhood, shared household responsibilities, went out to dinner on weekends, and kept a routine that, while predictable, felt safe. They worked in different fields but always showed mutual respect for each other's space and schedules. Michael, a software engineer, had a more flexible routine and often worked from home. Claire, a project manager at a design firm, left early and returned in the late afternoon, almost always at the same time. Their life followed what you'd expect from a couple with so many years together. It was precisely because of this predictability that the first changes caught attention. There wasn't a big event, a memorable fight, or a sudden withdrawal. The shifts were silent. Michael started to notice Claire becoming more distant. She wasn't aggressive or cold, but she avoided longer conversations. Affection became rare, goodnight kisses turned into rushed touches, and lingering glances disappeared. Whenever he tried to bring up something more personal, she'd change the subject or say she was tired. Small excuses began appearing more often, last-minute meetings, dinners with coworkers, quick trips to the market that lasted longer than usual. None of it was blatant enough to seem like betrayal, but it left behind a trail of discomfort. The turning point for Michael came when Claire left her phone on the kitchen counter before heading out. It was just an ordinary morning, and he wasn't in the habit of checking his wife's phone. But when he glanced at the screen, he saw a notification disappear almost instantly, as if it had been received and deleted in the same second. He couldn't make out the content or the sender, but something about that moment stuck in his mind all day. From then on, he started paying closer attention. Without saying anything, he began noticing her arrival times, what she bought, the clothes she wore on days she claimed to be working late. He also started picking up on changes in her mood. Claire seemed to be mentally somewhere else, as if she were going through the motions while actually living in a different emotional space. Michael wasn't the impulsive type. He believed trust was the foundation of any relationship, but he also knew when someone close to him wasn't acting rationally. In the days that followed, he adopted a more analytical approach. He installed an app on his own phone that tracked the car's location, the one Claire used. Nothing invasive, just a shared tracking tool they'd used before on other occasions. He noticed certain routes didn't match what she said. On days she claimed to be at the office late, the car remained parked for long stretches in quiet residential areas with no explanation. He also saw duplicate purchases on her credit card statement and meals at restaurants he and Claire had never visited together. Even with these signs, Michael refused to jump to conclusions. Gathering evidence became almost a personal project. For weeks, he quietly collected information that, on its own, might seem irrelevant, but together formed a pattern. He observed the clothes Claire picked when she said she'd be working late. He noted her departure and arrival times, the gaps between messages and replies. He noticed her perfume had changed, that her smile when coming home had vanished, and that she seemed constantly on guard. He didn't talk about it with friends or family. He kept everything to himself, hoping he was overreacting. He wanted to believe it was just a phase, normal wear and tear after so many years together. But deep down, the unease grew. With each new detail, each suspicious clue, the certainty that something was wrong became harder to ignore. Still, there was no photo, no concrete message, no video or witness to confirm what he suspected. The most he had was a series of contradictory behaviors, odd hours, and flimsy excuses. It was like putting together a puzzle with pieces that fit, but without the picture on the box to confirm the result. That's when Michael realized he couldn't live with the doubt anymore. After weeks of gathering suspicions and indirect evidence, he decided he needed to confront Claire. He couldn't keep living in a constant state of alert. It was time to lay everything out and hear, straight from her, what was going on. Michael spent hours trying to organize his words before saying anything. He didn't want to make accusations or create a war zone at home. But he also couldn't keep swallowing the feeling of being deceived. He chose an ordinary night, a Sunday, when Claire had already showered and was getting ready for bed. He sat on the edge of the bed, looked her in the eye, and took a deep breath before starting. He spoke calmly, listing point by point what he'd observed. He told her he knew about the mismatched times, the inconsistent trips, the restaurants, the deleted messages. He didn't yell or lose control. He simply laid out, with precision and firmness, what he had noticed. Claire listened in silence at first. But when she realized where the conversation was headed, her whole posture changed. Her face transformed. Her gaze turned sharp, her breathing heavier. She cut Michael off mid-sentence and started speaking louder. What began as a defensive response turned into a direct attack. She accused her husband of being obsessive, of invading her privacy, of becoming controlling. She said he was seeing things that weren't there, interpreting every gesture as betrayal, and that this silent surveillance was already affecting her mental health. Her tone rose disproportionately, and before Michael could respond, Claire was on her feet, crying and pacing back and forth in the room, as if she were the one who'd been betrayed instead of confronted. She said she was exhausted, that she couldn't keep walking around the house like she was under surveillance. She shouted that the late-night outings had nothing to do with cheating, that she was helping a friend with depression who didn't want anyone to know. She said the silence, the rush, the strange hours were all because of someone else's pain, and she was just trying to be a good friend. She accused Michael of not trusting her, of not understanding how much she sacrificed for their relationship, and that while she worried about others, he only cared about finding flaws. The scene was so intense that for a few minutes, Michael stayed silent, stunned by the sudden reversal. She trembled, sobbed, and spoke in a desperate tone. She even said he was destroying what was left of their marriage, that this was the last straw, and that if he truly believed she could cheat, then maybe their love was already gone. That hurt. Michael found himself surrounded by a flood of accusations that, while completely disproportionate, carried an emotional weight hard to ignore. He tried to remember the facts, the inconsistencies, the signs, but none of it seemed to matter in the face of Claire's pain. The intensity of her reaction was so overwhelming that he started doubting his own perception. Michael wasn't weak, but in that moment, he felt broken down. His words, so carefully chosen, were thrown back at him as empty accusations from a paranoid person. And slowly, doubt crept in. What if she was telling the truth? What if it was all just a series of misinterpreted coincidences? What if he was letting unresolved insecurities take over? Claire kept crying, now sitting in the corner of the bed, saying she'd never felt so humiliated, so disrespected, so alone in her own home. Michael, overwhelmed by the emotional storm, ended up apologizing. He said he might have gone too far, that he didn't know how to handle the changes, and that he never meant to hurt her. Claire accepted the apology with tears, but without relief. She said she needed time to rebuild trust. Michael nodded, promising to do everything he could to fix the mistake he now believed he'd made. In the days that followed, the house returned to its usual silence, but with a different atmosphere. Claire started acting with more kindness and presence, as if she genuinely wanted to restore the connection that once seemed lost. Michael, still carrying a trace of doubt deep inside, chose to trust. He didn't want to live in constant conflict. He decided to believe he'd made a mistake. And that decision allowed them to spend the next 2 months in peace. Their routine took on a new tone. They started going out to dinner again. Claire suggested a small trip for the following month. Kisses regained their time, conversations regained their laughter. Michael, relieved, thought maybe it had all just been a scare, a poorly handled crisis. Claire, in turn, seemed lighter, more devoted. The days passed like this, carried by a false sense of reconnection, as if everything were falling back into place. It was a Friday like any other, but Michael had woken up with a different impulse. After 2 months of apparent reconciliation with Claire, he felt their relationship was finally moving toward a lighter place. They'd had dinner together twice that week. She'd surprised him with a sweet note on the fridge door, and for the first time in a long time, he wondered if he'd been unfair in his past suspicions. Determined to strengthen this new phase, he left work early to buy a simple but meaningful gift. He wanted to give it to her that night, no special occasion, just to mark a fresh start. On his way to the mall, he took a different route. He wanted to avoid traffic and enjoy the rest of the afternoon. When he stopped at a red light on a quieter street, Michael's gaze was drawn to a cafe across the sidewalk. It was a place he recognized but had never been to. It took just a second for everything to collapse. Through the wide window, he saw Claire sitting at a table near the glass. She was with Zach Foster, his best friend since college. What stood out wasn't just his presence, but how they were sitting, hands linked on the table, smiling, laughing like teenagers, eyes locked with intimacy and ease. The world seemed to spin backward. The gift he'd planned to buy lost all meaning. The steering wheel in his hands felt distant. Within seconds, Michael parked haphazardly and crossed the street. There was no anger on his face. What he felt was a sharp coldness, absolute clarity. He opened the cafe door calmly, walked straight to their table without looking away, and stopped beside Zach's chair. Claire saw him first. She froze. Her hand stayed on Zach's, and only after a few seconds, realizing Michael was there, did she try to pull it back. But it was too late. Michael looked at both of them, took a deep breath, and spoke firmly, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "So this is who she's been with all this time?" Zach couldn't answer. Claire tried to speak, but no sound came out. Michael continued. "You came into my house, called me brother, sat at my table, while you were behind my back with my wife." He turned to Claire, now visibly shaken. "And you, Claire? You made me believe I was going crazy, that I was destroying our marriage with suspicion. You cried, yelled, lied straight to my face. All of that to defend this?" The silence in the cafe was absolute. Some people stopped eating. Others just looked down. Claire looked stunned. Zach kept his eyes fixed on the table, as if the wood could save him. Michael took a step back, looked at them one last time, and ended with a cold statement. "You two deserve each other." Without waiting for a reply, he turned and walked out. There was no scandal, no shouting, no attempt to stop him. The cafe door closed behind him like a final period. Michael went home with a shattered heart, but a clear mind. He no longer needed proof or explanations. The truth had finally revealed itself right in front of him. He packed his things calmly, separated documents, clothes, and personal items, and called the landlord of the house he shared with Claire. Since it was a rental, the process was easier. He requested to terminate the lease and said he'd be out by the end of the week. He also told Claire he wanted to end the rental agreement and that she should either find a new place or sign a new lease on her own. In less than 3 days, he found a small apartment in another neighborhood, a quiet, simple place where he could breathe. Claire didn't try to contact him. She just left her keys at the real estate office, signed the lease termination papers days later, and disappeared. No more conversations. No more explanations. The betrayal Michael had only sensed now had shape, color, and name. And though pain was present in every move, there was also a strange sense of relief. Because the worst part wasn't finding out. The worst part had been doubting himself for so long. Now, he finally knew the truth. And that was all he needed to start over. In the days after the breakup, Michael stayed quiet. Not out of pride, but because he was still processing what he'd seen. He avoided talking about it, didn't respond to messages, and just focused on the essentials. But the silence didn't last long. Close friends, who had already noticed his more withdrawn behavior, started asking. First came his oldest co-workers, then the couples they used to host for weekend dinners, and finally the friends he shared with Claire. He didn't dramatize it or try to play the victim. He told them exactly what happened in that cafe, without embellishment, just the facts as they were. The betrayal, the affair with Zach, the scene in front of everyone, the immediate breakup. That was enough. The news spread quickly through their social circle. Everyone knew Zach, some even considered him part of the family. He was always at gatherings, birthdays, holidays. The betrayal carried double weight. It wasn't just about marital infidelity, it was about a deep breach of trust. The friends' reaction was nearly unanimous. First came shock, then distance. People who used to text Claire daily started ignoring her messages. Event invitations stopped coming. Group chats went silent. A few confronted her directly, but most just withdrew without warning. No one wanted to take sides, but neither could they pretend nothing had happened. Claire, realizing the growing isolation, tried to respond. She reached out to mutual friends, wrote long messages justifying her actions, said things weren't as simple as they seemed, that there were layers to the story. She tried to paint Michael as someone ruled by emotion, someone who overinterpreted everything. But her words found no echo. The strength of the confrontation, the impact of the public scene, and the involvement with someone so close to Michael made any excuse irrelevant. No one wanted to listen. No one wanted to get involved. and loneliness settled in quietly but definitively. Zach, meanwhile, didn't escape the consequences either. Co-workers, childhood friends, even distant acquaintances started avoiding him. He got cold stares, harsh messages, and watched doors close. What used to be an active, welcoming social network turned into a desert of interactions. Even those who didn't want to judge knew he'd crossed unacceptable lines. And in this new reality, Claire and Zach did what seemed inevitable: they decided to leave the city. The move happened fast. They found an apartment in Portland, where no one knew them. They rented a modest place far from the center, trying to start from scratch. Claire took few belongings, leaving behind almost everything tied to her old life. Zach did the same. They avoided contact with old friends, deleted social media profiles, and cut ties. In the new city, they presented themselves as an ordinary couple, newly arrived, with no complicated stories to explain. They went to cafes, local markets, and started building a shared routine. At first, there was a certain lightness in the air. As if distance had erased the traces of the past. Claire tried to smile more, Zach kept a calm demeanor, as if nothing had happened. They spent afternoons decorating their new apartment, buying simple items, picking wall colors. There was a sincere effort to start over, to make it work, to turn what began with destruction into a new phase of building. But behind every gesture was a silence neither of them mentioned, a silence made of everything they'd left behind, and which, sooner or later, would demand its price. Life in Portland didn't take long to show its cracks. Claire's initial enthusiasm gave way to a constant sense of displacement. The new city didn't feel like a fresh start, but like exile. Zach, on the other hand, seemed to adapt easily. He discovered new places without effort, made shallow friendships at local bars, and maintained a polite but distant attitude. Claire tried to fill her days with chores, small freelance projects, and solo trips to the supermarket. Slowly, she realized her life with Zach was filled with long silences and mechanical replies. The closeness they had at first faded, turning into a cold, predictable coexistence. The first clear sign of betrayal came in a mundane way. An accidental notification on Zach's phone, left on the living room table. Claire didn't want to snoop, but the message flashed long enough to make it obvious something was hidden. The name was unfamiliar, the tone intimate, the content impossible to ignore. In the following days, she watched in silence. She noticed unexplained outings, changes in habits, hushed phone calls in the bathroom. She didn't need much to confirm it. One day, when he left for a supposed work meeting, Claire decided to follow him. And what she found was the final scene of what was left of her attempt to restart: Zach walking down the sidewalk hand in hand with another woman, just as comfortable as he'd been with her months before. She waited for him to come home. She didn't cause a scene or break anything. When Zach walked in, Claire was sitting at the kitchen table, eyes fixed on nothing. She simply asked if he had anything to say. He sighed, sat across from her, and answered with the coldness of someone who'd already rehearsed it all. He said things weren't working, that she was too intense, that the relationship had lost its spark. He confirmed he was seeing someone else and saw no point in continuing something that clearly no longer existed. He didn't apologize, didn't hesitate, showed no regret. He just stood up, went to the bedroom, grabbed a few clothes, and left. Claire stayed there, alone, sitting in the same chair for hours. The pain wasn't just about the betrayal, but about the irony of it all. She'd traded a solid, if worn, marriage for a relationship built on lies. And now, she was the one being discarded. Within days, she terminated the apartment lease and returned to her parents' house, no announcement, no farewell. The welcome was cold. Her parents didn't ask questions, just gave her the old room and returned to their routine, as if she were just a temporary guest. Old friends didn't reply to her messages. The city where she grew up now felt smaller, suffocating, full of memories that hurt more than comforted. Meanwhile, Michael moved in a different direction. changing homes had done him good. He invested in himself, picked up old hobbies, threw himself into his work. He started therapy, not to understand Claire, but to understand himself. He wasn't in a rush to rebuild his emotional life, but gradually realized the peace he now felt was more valuable than any forced relationship. He reconnected with old friends, joined work gatherings, and above all, learned to appreciate the silence he once feared. Pain had turned into learning. And while the past still lingered, it no longer dictated the rhythm of his days. Zach, on the other hand, kept living as if nothing had happened. In Portland, he moved from one woman to the next as easily as changing shirts. No relationship lasted. No connection ran deep. He repeated the cycle of charm, involvement, and abandonment with the same coldness he'd shown ending things with Claire. Some began to notice the pattern, others stepped back before getting hurt. Zach didn't care. He wasn't looking for stability, didn't want lasting bonds. He was an empty man, filled with temporary distractions, incapable of staying long enough to build anything real. Claire, back at her parents' house, lived like a shadow of her former self. She avoided going out, spent her days in front of the computer, trying to find a reason to start over. At night, she mentally reviewed every choice, every word spoken, every chance ignored. She didn't reach out to Michael, she knew she wouldn't be welcome. She also knew he never wanted to hear her voice again. And maybe that was the harshest punishment of all, knowing no one was willing to listen anymore. That the words that once deceived now had nowhere to echo. She'd lost everything. And the pain she felt didn't come from missing Zach, but from the awareness that there was no going back. Because some losses leave no room for return. Only regret. And silence. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.